So what I want to do today is I want to talk about the ENSO inspired drought of 1877 and its impacts on Singapore. But what I also want to do is kind of preface that by actually looking at some of the broader research that I've been doing over the last however many years on reclaiming the archives of societies to understand more about weather, long-term weather patterns, and also extreme weathers. And convincing literature citing the value of extended instrumental observational data sets to recreate past weather conditions, look at climatic trends, look at variability, and also for identifying potential anthropogenic climatic changes. And in particular, instrumental observations, which usually we consider to date back over a period of about 200 years or more. I mean, there were instrumental observations before this, but they become sketchier the further you go back in the past. But these instrumental records are considered vital for calibrating differences between natural proxy reconstructions and model simulations. But whilst this has been done quite extensively for the Northern Hemisphere, particularly for Europe and the US, the instrumental record for Southeast Asia is really patchy, which leads to ultimately less accurate climate reconstructions and even lots of gaps and grey areas. And this is a problem for some of the scientific models which this kind of data contributes to. So for kind of big reanalyses, for example, say like the 20th century reanalysis, which relies on data assimilation from surface observations of synoptic pressure, we really need much better data quality and quantity over longer time periods. So this is one of the things that I've been working on over the last number of years. And one of the things, though, in looking for all this data, I mean, ultimately, I'm a historian, not a historical climatologist or a scientist. So one of the things that's been really great for me trying to reclaim some of these meteorological records, weather records, is actually being able to look at extreme events, the occurrence of extreme events, and thinking around kind of the narratives and social impacts of these as well. And in particular, I've become very interested in looking at patterns of human and environmental interaction. So what I want to do for this paper is bring something of a climatic perspective to Singaporean history by exploring in greater depth the El Niño inspired drought of 1877. So the years 1876 to about 78 have been described by many scientists as being probably one of the strongest El Niño events globally, probably as part of a protracted episode. And the significance of the protracted events is not simply the duration, but the potential for stronger impacts than the classical El Niño event. And we see this very strongly in places like China, nice dry period, which actually had the social impact of creating extreme famine over a long period of time. But Southeast Asia hasn't really been looked at quite so much from this sense. I think Brendan Buckley may have done a very small amount on this, but nothing's really been done on this event for Singapore or for Malaysia. So I've been really interested to see, what the impacts of this drought were here. And it was certainly the case. I started doing some research in the newspapers, just as kind of a general overview. And it was certainly the case that there was a long protracted drought here in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and over East Malaysia as well. And it was considered the first and one of the worst droughts in the record of the British documents since 1819. But whilst I'm interested in looking at the meteorology of the event, With my historian's hat on, what I'm also interested in is the impacts of this event on contemporary Singapore. And I would contend in this paper that the impacts of the event are actually less to do with the meteorology, to do with the lack of rainfall, and more connected to the nexus of human-induced vulnerability to drought, urbanization in the port town at that time. But first, what I want to do is actually have a little bit of a look at some of the records that we can use to actually reconstruct some of these events in more detail. So this is a very basic timeline here of some of the main data forms some of the main data that's available for Singapore weather. And one of the problems in looking for weather information for this part of the world is the huge gaps, the huge observational gaps that are here. And the reasons for this are both historic and also political. Most of the early instrumental weather records stem from the colonial period. And the problem is when you have the end of colonialism, a lot of the records, they dissipate. They dissipated in some part because of the Second World War, particularly in Singapore with the raised earth policies at the point of the Japanese occupation. But then a lot of other records also got scattered as well at the point of independence too. And so with countries and regions kind of changing hands and changing politics, surviving information ends up being scattered across the globe, which makes recovering the information often a very difficult and arduous task. Now, the other thing, the 19th century certainly is centered on the urban areas and the peri-urban areas. Due to the fact politically here, British influence was less widespread in the rural areas, so that the main Straits Settlements are covered. So Georgetown, Malacca, Singapore are very well covered. But as soon as you get out into the more rural areas, which were the FMS and the unfederated Malay states, there's not so much for those areas, which is a great shame because you don't get that kind of complete picture for the region so well. And with the exception of a few kind of isolated recordings, usually by plantation owners, people who are interested in weather for its own sake, or particularly for periods of extreme weather. So for example, during a flood, you'd often get like a 2 or 3 week kind of data set where some local plantation owner just got really interested and was recording, say, flood heights along with kind of rainfall for particular periods. But apart from that, the majority of the records are urban. This also was connected not just to do with the diffusion of political power, but also where there were actually settlements where you could have proper meteorological facilities and scientific hubs are often kind of based, the research is often based around the urban areas, the port cities. So what you find with the record through kind of certain phases, the very initial phase, which coincides with the early settlement, is often the observations are made by the military, usually in the sense of the early East India Company military officials who were really interested in the relationship between the environment, the weather, and the possibilities for settlement. And so the very early readings are usually around the military bases, so Fort Canning. In Georgetown, it was also the same. And then we kind of move beyond that into some of the other first things, which actually I haven't mentioned here because they're not such long-term data sets, but records that were made by doctors. So you get some medical, meteorological topographies created of the island in the 1820s and 1830s, because the doctors were interested in, well, not just, can this island be settled as a colony, but is it going to be a healthy place to be settled as a colony as well? So then we kind of move on and you get these kind of piecemeal observations. There are some observations that are published in the press in the 1830s, but I'm not entirely sure where they came from. But they are sporadic throughout the 1830s into 1840. And then you get some kind of enthusiasts like this missionary, Joseph Trevely, who took And then the most comprehensive pre-1850s data set, which is from the Singapore Observatory, the very short-lived Singapore Observatory, which was operational for 4 years. Ostensibly, it was actually a magnetic observatory, but they were taking pressure and temperature at the same time. Now, this was based just round about the area where the Lavender MRT is today, just on the other side of that intersection. So that was, at that time, it was also a nice rural station as well. It was described as being about 3 miles out of town. So that's quite an interesting set of observations there. We've then got a huge gap for the 1850s, a gap that I've been really trying to dig to fill in. Why is there a gap in the 1850s? Could not really work it out at all, with the exception of the fact that by this point, the military kind of initial impetus had disappeared, and there hadn't been really anyone who took over the meteorological role. That doesn't really start until the 1860s, and people start getting a lot more interested in meteorology for its own sake, partly because of kind of a global push to extend observational records. But meteorology becomes more kind of standardized and also more kind of pushed into departments. So you can get a sense of like the lighthouse. You've also got plantation owners, which are essentially private individuals who are interested in weather and rainfall for its own sake in terms of agriculture. But then 1869 marks a bit of a change. And from then onwards, the weather records become officially registered under the medical department. So this is great for us because it means that we get a really formal set of records from 1869 onwards. 1869, the records were being taken at the convict jail hospital in Singapore, but then from 1875, they moved to the Kandang Kabau Hospital, which I will show you in just a second. So I've got a map here. You can actually see on the map just under kind of the race course, you've got the hospital here, and there's actually a formal meteorological observatory, and this becomes the head essentially of meteorology for Singapore right through until the early 20th century. Probably around about the 1910s sometime. This is kind of the main place, or about 1917 actually. It's the main place where observations are being taken for Singapore. It wasn't the only station. There are actually a number of other stations around the city as well. But this was the one where we have the most surviving records. So the so this is kind of the overview, the long picture of the kinds of weather records that I've been collating over the last few years, and I've been trying to get this consistent long-term data set specifically for Singapore. I'm working on Malaysia as well, but that's been a bit more scattered. And then, of course, COVID happened and things kind of went a little bit awry. But what's been really nice is being able to look at these kind of periods of extreme weather as well for Singapore. And then being able to extend outwards from the meteorological records to look more at the social components of these particular extreme events. So the records that I've been using for the 1877 drought are actually quite varied. They derive from many years of archival research for Singapore and also for Malaysia. And again, in a very scattered way, the libraries and archives in Kuala Lumpur, in Singapore, in London, and in Cambridge, because this is where some of the main kind of colonial records are kept for the history of meteorology, for colonial science, the weather, official records on urban development and land use change, things about hydraulic engineering, things about flood and flood mitigation, as well as official medical statistics, which is also important because that obviously correlates with the weather too in the 19th century medical meteorology genre. And then also thinking a bit more about narrative accounts of weather extremes, often from the press, the newspapers. Now, one of the issues is, again, as I said, that these records are piecemeal. They have to be recovered and reconnected, a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle, but sadly one that ends up with horrible gaps in it. And omissions in detail that would be really far more useful to a climate scientist, maybe not so much for a historian, but for a climate scientist, that kind of precision of some of the records is not there. So for example, a lot of the registering stations where they were making the readings are not given exact latitudes and longitudes, which is really frustrating. Some of the early maps were drawn on this kind of grid pattern where they have like one latitude and longitude for a very, very large area, kind of almost covering the whole of the island. So you'll find that you'll get latitude and longitude on the observations, but it will be the same as all the other registering stations, even though you know that they were actually at different places around the island. So that's kind of frustrating. So you end up having to recreate and look back at some of the maps and get kind of an idea of exactly where the observations were from the early maps and the references that have been left. The other issue as well is thinking about how the observations were being made and kept. Were they being made the thermometer under shade, or was it in the direct sun? Obviously that's going to make a huge difference. And also the skill of the observer as well. I've come across a really disturbing number of contemporary reports and actually reasons for why there was a push to have a formal meteorological department created in the 1920s because of the criticism of the observations that had been made in the previous few decades by contemporary observers, in the sense that the people who were making the observations were not necessarily trained, well, they definitely weren't trained meteorologists. So there's a certain sketchiness in some of these observations, which we have to kind of negotiate around. So those problems aside, going back to the 1877 event, what is really good from this event is that by this point, as I said, the observations were being made in this formal observatory, and we hope that they are a little bit more detailed. Excuse me. Now, you can see from this picture here that there is extreme amount of detail, and this is a point where you've got a lot of standardization and observations as well. So you can see that that they're really kind of making a very good effort here. We've got a lot more information on exactly where the thermometers were being kept, where the barometers were, exactly the height of the rain gauge. So you've got a lot more detail to actually kind of put this into context. And these are some quite amazing records, I think. The other great thing as well is that they were not just being taken daily, but they were being made sub-daily as well. So we've got this kind of incredible surviving record. And these observations that were being made at this observatory were printed in the press, in the newspapers, and also the government gazettes, unlike some of the other registering stations, which is why we've got such a comprehensive record of these. And the project that I've been working on over the last few years has actually digitized all of these through 1875 to about 1917. So these records are actually available for use now as well. So let's take a closer look at the meteorology for 1877. Okay, so the annual total rainfall reads at around 65 inches. And putting that into perspective, over the last 30 years or so, or slightly more actually, it's usually just an average rainfall is around about 85 inches. So you can see that there was definitely lower than average rainfall in 1877, albeit certainly not, perhaps a hugely lower amount. But what you do, I looked at this as well through the PDSI as well for 1877. And although the map is slightly sketchy, the lack of detail, you kind of got some corroborating evidence here from the PDSI reconstruction that you've obviously got, quite severe drought conditions at this point in time. But of course, the annual rainfall figures themselves can actually be misleading. It's more about the density and spread of the rainfall across the year, which is perhaps the more significant thing. And the 1877 drought started in February, which is the usual dry period in Singapore. But what happens is it extends across what would have been the normal the intermonsoonal period and the southwest monsoon across the summer as well. So that kind of fails to materialize that year. And the drought doesn't break till December 1877. But going back to wearing my historian's hat, the meteorology is fascinating in some ways, but I would say that you can't really get much of a sense of the human side of the story just from rainfall records. And the other thing is that I think that there's an important interaction, which is also to do with, the impact, which is actually created less from perhaps the lack of rain, but more through human politics and things that are happening on the ground. So there's all these kind of other issues, particularly socio-economic adaptivity, which actually makes a population more vulnerable to the impacts of drought. So this is what essentially I want to turn to next. So what happens in February 1877? Well, you have the normal dry period, but then the slightly wetter period doesn't actually materialize in kind of March and April. And so by mid-April, the inhabitants of Singapore are really starting to get a little bit nervous. And there are newspaper reports talking about the scarcity of water, which is being felt most keenly throughout the entire town. And other newspaper reports are saying that the small amount of water that was actually left was increasingly dirty and undrinkable. And it doesn't come as much of a surprise when we realize that in 1877, most of the inhabitants relied on a very antiquated system of wells, tanks and small reservoirs, which were situated mainly in and around the town centre. Now, I've put this map up here. This map is actually a slightly later map from 1911, partly because I wanted to kind of go back and think about the extension of the water supply later. But in 1877, that is basically the only main tank that's there for the urban centre at that particular time. And the problem with this tank as well is the competition, not just from urban inhabitants, but also from the port area, because the tank was also supplying the ships that came into port as well for their fresh water. The other thing that happens in 1877 is the McRitchie Reservoir. I'm well aware that the official opening date is actually slightly later than 1877, but it actually opened in December 1877. It just wasn't, the ceremony wasn't held until kind of the next year. So what's called the Impounding Reservoir, which is now McRitchie, that opened at the very end of December 1877, and that was a major boon for helping to end the drought, of course. But so for the majority of the drought, though, it was just this main tank at Fort Canning. The Mount Emily tank, which is here, didn't open until 1878, and the one at Pearl's Hill was a few years later as well, I think. So this was a major issue, so basically the lack of water supply, particularly clean water supply. Now, the other thing is about piped water. Piped water was available for domestic dwellings, but of course it was a privilege only for the wealthy. And the system of ceramic underground commonplace in Britain and had already been exported out to India, hadn't actually made it yet to the Straits Settlements. The Straits Settlements always tended to be slightly behind in other areas, partly because of lack of funding from the British government in London. And so the majority of the residents were relying on these wells and standpipes in the streets, which meant having to queue up for very long hours in order to access water. So the other social impact, of course, was cholera. And this was, I would say, cholera was perhaps more of a major fear and paranoia than perhaps a reality. Although the origins of cholera being from polluted water supplies had been known since the 1850s, There was still a lot of fear about exactly where cholera was coming from. Was it coming from some kind of like poisonous miasma, from kind of bad smells and brackish drains, and how far it was actually contagious as well. Some of these old ideas were still kind of in the common consciousness at the time. And so there's a lot of hype in the press about cholera, and obviously a lot of fear amongst the population about a cholera epidemic breaking out. And the reports are actually very, very saying that there's at least 20 people dying every day in the kampong from cholera. But they're not being reported because the Malays were worried about the trouble it would get them into with the government if these statistics were officially reported. And you then get a counter narrative running much more from the top down, which is also about government actually blaming the people for getting sick by drinking at polluted wells and polluted water sources. And actually kind of very much saying, well, it's kind of almost your own fault for drinking this bad water. You shouldn't have done this, which, you kind of wonder exactly what they were thinking, that, what else would people be doing, if there's no other water supply. And this kind of narrative surfaces and resurfaces over again. But what you find is when you look at the actual medical statistics, that there isn't so much. There is mention of cholera outbreaks, but not too much, slightly higher than would be normal. What you get more of is just comments about the general poor state of health of the colony for that year, especially amongst the very poor and prisoners. So the criminal prison report, for example, noted how the health of incoming prisoners wasn't as good as normal, citing want and disease induced by the long drought. And indeed, there are lots of other reports along these lines as well, reporting drought-induced brackish drains, foul smells, dried up watercourses, and the unbearable great heat. So regardless of the official statistics, Singapore was certainly not a healthy place to be in 1877. And there is just one other thing I want to mention about the official statistics as well, is that the death records from cholera usually only came about when somebody would be presented to the coroner or the official hospital death records. They were not taking into account deaths kind of in the more rural areas. So the hospital records themselves are perhaps slightly skewed. So this brings us again to the second issue that I want to think about, which is the level of socioeconomic adaptive capacity within the town. And by the time of this drought in 1877, the port of Singapore was, as we know, the administrative center of the Straits Settlements, and had developed into a very busy, bustling township of around 96,000 inhabitants. But most of these inhabitants were driven by an influx of mostly male migrant labor. And many of these immigrants who are rapidly coming into Singapore were not necessarily refugees. And a lot of them were, well, some of them were skilled, but a lot of them were unskilled laborers. So not unsurprisingly, this creates a situation where poverty characterizes the circumstances for many inhabitants. So this leaves large sections of the population very vulnerable. And doing a little bit of digging, I mean, you can definitely say that Singapore is a highly stratified social and colonial society. So despite the British dominance politically, the British and Europeans only made up about 2% of the population. And in terms of social class, the most well-to-do was only around about 385 people. So you can see, although it's hard to kind of make up the social stratification of the bulk of the majority, we can certainly say that there was a huge, historians like Jim Warren, for example, who's done extensive social histories on kind of the laboring classes in Singapore, suggested that, there is this kind of huge bulk of, majority of the population who were essentially kind of unskilled labor. So these are the people who, when you have a drought, are most susceptible to fluctuating prices of things like staple foodstuffs and water. So you get an increase in the cost of water, purchase water to 5 cents a bucket. But what you also get as well is an impact. At this time, Singapore was not self-sustainable. In terms of, I mean, you've got vegetables, you've got pork and chicken being grown locally, and of course you've got plantation farming across the peninsula, but a lot of the plantation farming was for export, not for domestic markets. And Singapore itself is still relying on Malaysia, but also in particular Thailand for import of the staple rice. And you can see from this chart here, I mean, it doesn't look like a huge increase, but you can see a big increase in 1878. So up to the year after the drought itself, there is a big increase in the price of rice, which of course is the main staple for the majority. And you get a massive shift as well in where the Singapore is actually getting its rice from. It shifts from Thailand to British Burma very temporarily for about a year or so. But overall trade was poor as well, of general goods for imports and exports, and for merchandise, equating to around about a 10% change in dollar value, as opposed to a normal kind of 1% in other years. And this shift was also attributed to a keenness of competition. And one of the causes, interestingly, for this competition was a series of major conflicts. And whilst the drought was not quoted in the government records per se as being the reason for this, the fact that there were major fires during 1877, I don't think is a coincidence that there was major drought conditions at the same time. So just moving on to a few consequences and kind of more concluding remarks. So it's quite obvious that whilst Singapore didn't necessarily suffer in the same way that perhaps other parts of Asia suffered from this drought period, it did suffer, and there were some interesting consequences to come out of it scientifically, and also in terms of engineering responses to improving water supply, both for just improving the supply, but also in terms of public health improvements as well. And I don't think it's any coincidence that interest in meteorology, especially in rainfall, increased after 1877. Partly this is connected to a major kind of global push for improving meteorological records. But it was quite obvious that when this series of simultaneous droughts occurred across large swathes of the globe, from Brazil to China to Australia, over this period of 2 years, it was clear to many that looking more into the idea of a kind of teleconnected regional climate, whereas previously the idea of climate, certainly in Malaysia and Singapore, had been considered more on a localized basis. So this is kind of where we get this kind of sense of teleconnections being understood more in science. They still didn't have the concept of ENSO at this time, but they were realizing that, you know, what was happening in one area was definitely, you know, connected in some way to other regions. And this was partly inspired by some of the kind of big names of the day, like Charles Todd in Australia, or Henry Blanford in the Indian Meteorological Department, who started devoting research into this. And the other thing is that the sense that droughts and thus climate might be linked across wide areas grew over the ensuing decades. You see this a lot in the correspondence between the British Association for the Advancement of Science and the Secretary of State for the Colonies over the next couple of decades, and suggesting that the scientific world was really more keen to invest time and resources into the phenomenon, because there hadn't really been any systematic analysis of this previously. And in the Straits year or two after this drought, it's still kind of a big thing in people's memories. And you get a massive increase in the number of rain gauges that are instituted across the entire Malayan Peninsula after this time, partly due to some champions within the medical department who are really, really keen. T. Irvin Rao, for example, who's the head of, who's the colonial surgeon for a point in time in the early 1880s. And he was really keen in actually pushing for more rain gauges to be instituted so they could have a better rainfall record. And the other thing that's connected to this as well, which is there was more research into the idea of desiccation, which is the theory of, which is one of the dominant climate change theories of the 19th century. And there was a big discussion after 1877 about whether the settlement had actually caused the drought themselves by actually changing the local environment through this idea of desiccation, which is you chop down the trees, you change the rainfall. And that actually inspired a massive, and I just show you this, some of the proposed forest reserves, which were proposed just after this drought. And the government actually specifically said, I want you to look into whether cutting down, and we should actually, there were several reports commissioned at that time into this issue. And these proposed forest reserves were done not just in terms of preserving the economic resource of the forest, but also to try and help mitigate the problem of supposed decreasing rainfall in the peninsula itself. So these are some of the forest reserves that were proposed in the early 1880s. And you see this as a direct result is coming out of this drought. The other thing that really comes up around this time as well is also more investment in the infrastructure to manage drought too. It doesn't happen overnight, partly because the McRitchie Reservoir project was completed in the end of 1877. And I think there were great hopes that that was going to mitigate a lot of the problem. It was only around about the early 1900s, the colonial engineer was going, you know what, guys, population has increased so much, we are going to be out of water again, like really, really quickly. There was massive kind of population increase and also more urbanization, particularly around the Tanjong Pagar area as well. So they realized pretty quickly that what they had wasn't going to be enough. But I think for a few years, they were kind of thinking that McRitchie would resolve some of the issues, as well as the new reservoir at Mount Emily as well. That the Straits Settlements were still something of an outlier in the British Empire's journey towards improving water management and also towards improving meteorological knowledge more broadly. And this is quite apparent in the fact that, unlike, say, Hong Kong, which had a proper observatory from 1884, or India, which had the Indian Meteorological Department from the 1870s. Malaya doesn't get its own meteorological department until 1929. And this is largely because of the impetus from after the First World War and the introduction of commercial aviation into Malaya as well, which really kind of provided this kind of impetus to actually have a proper formal meteorological department. After meteorology came away from the medical department in the early 19-teens, it actually went under the museums department for some time, which is obviously not a very good state of affairs. So, there was really, with aviation being introduced commercially into Malaya in the late 20s and early 30s, it was, it's really considered imperative that there needs to be a proper scientific department. But the situation in the Straits Settlements also reflected in many ways the British government's positioning on funding the colony for much of this period, preferring instead monies to be raised for such projects from local philanthropy and for the local. The other problem as well at this time, which is more of a general problem, was the lack of scientific knowledge about tropical climates within the intertropical convergence zone. And this, of course, played a role in shaping these attitudes as well. And there was also a general sense as well that while Singapore and Malaysian Peninsula did have droughts, it didn't suffer the extremes of weather that other parts of the British Empire did. It was kind of considered to have this kind of much more temperate and milder climate. So in many respects, the events of 1877 actually took the colony by surprise, which is why I think you get a lot of this kind of moving around afterwards to kind of go, oh, hold on, we need to rethink about, what drought means and whether we're going to have another drought, which is another reason for investing more in these long-term rainfall records. So it was kind of a two-pronged approach of, how severe and how frequent, which is one of the questions that they were. That's kind of pretty much it. And if you're interested in looking any more at the meteorological records for Singapore, I'm about to have something published in Climate of the Past, actually, hopefully it'll be out in the next month or two, which is actually a more detailed look at the long-term series which I've been building for the Straits Settlements. So it's focusing actually on Penang and also on Singapore. This is work that I've been doing with the UK Meteorological Office under their ACRE project, the Atmospheric Circulation Reconstructions over the Earth project, over a number of years. And as I said, some of the information, most of the information is not available in an obvious way, but it's available on request if anyone's interested. And some of it's also been filtered into some of the international databases as well, like the ISPD. So it's actually there for use as well. Okay, thank you very much.